Rooks, Alan said. So Piton left. Tremendous figure of my childhood. That was Alan the writer, the man with the childhood, the man with the sensibility. I understood this idea of the writer because it was so like my own when I had first come to England. Then I would have envied Alan the material available to him, my landlord, the manor, the setting, his deep knowledge of the setting, the London parties I occasionally saw him at. But Alan seemed to have as much trouble with his idea of the writer and his material as I had had with mine. At first he used to hint that he was at work on a book, hinting that the part of him that one saw, the part he was displaying in the manor grounds or at a London party, was just a fraction of his personality, or even a disguise, that the true personality would be revealed in that book he was writing. His radio reviews and discussions and his short printed pieces had the same suggestion, that he was fully engaged elsewhere, in some bigger venture. But no book came from Alan. No novel or autobiographical novel, setting the record straight, showing the truth behind the shiny bright clothes and the clowning manner, no critical study of contemporary literature, which he sometimes spoke about, no Isherwood-like book about post-war Germany, which he spoke about at other times. Eventually, with me, he stopped hinting that he was writing. But he still talked like a writer and behaved like a writer. And that writer's personality of Alan's was partly genuine, and no more fraudulent than my own character, my idea of myself as a writer, had been in 1950. Just as, in my writing in those days, I was hiding my experience from myself, hiding myself from my experience, to that extent falsifying things, yet at the same time revealing them to anyone who looked beyond the conventional words and forms and attitudes I was aiming at, so all the literary sides of his character that Alan exhibited, all the books he said he was writing, hinted at truths that were as hard for him to face as certain things had been for me. That Isherwood-like book about post-war Germany hinted at the dissatisfactions and torments of his emotional life and his involvement with a young German for whose sake he had gone to live in Germany for some time. He spoke of this attachment obliquely at the beginning, as though testing my reaction to a confession of passion from him, half a clown, as though testing my reaction to sexual inversion. Either my reaction didn't satisfy him, or he changed his mind, or his attitude to this unhappy affair altered as he began to talk about it to me, a stranger. He dropped the subject. The sketch of the young German remained unfinished, and Alan's references to Germany thereafter were straightforwardly political or cultural. And there was his autobiographical novel, the story of his childhood and the development of his sensibility. It was to be an absolute compendium of such books. His wish, as I understood too well, was to say to the world, I too have witnessed these things and felt these emotions. But below his wish to do all that had already been done, to display knowledge of all the settings, or their equivalents, that had occurred in similar books, there was something in his childhood or upbringing or family life which had deeply wounded him, had committed him to solitude, uncertainty, and imperfect life. His literary approach to his experience, the self-regard that would have gone with its frankness, on approved topics, no doubt, homosexuality, masturbation, social climbing, perhaps hid the cause of his incompleteness from himself. And often in London, considering his over-skittishness at parties, his startling, self-mocking dress, his nervousness in the presence of people he admired, his extravagant flattery of those persons, often in London, considering him, I felt I was considering an aspect of myself from some years back. And I had an intimation that those overbright moments of Alan's would have been followed in the solitude of his rooms or flat by self-disgust, rage, wretchedness. And I could see how the solitude of the manor, the walks in the ruined garden, would have been, in addition to its literary suitability, a kind of therapy for him. Therapy over and above his pleasure at having rich friends, because writers, as Cyril Connolly had said, should have rich friends, over and above his pleasure at saying to me, because it was old-fashioned, before the deluge, I telephone and have Phillips meet me at the station, not saying, Mr. Phillips, or Stanley, or Stan. And there was the house itself. It had a staff, and it still worked as a big house, more or less. It offered a room and a bathroom with refurbished plumbing. It offered from the back windows, as I supposed, I hadn't seen it, a view of the garden, the river, the water meadows on both sides of the river, with the empty downs beyond, an untouched view, a view without other houses or people, a calming view. For Alan it would have been a house without any kind of strain, making no demand on him, not requiring him to act or maintain a particular personality. There was my landlord. For me it would have been a strain to be in the house with him, a strain to meet him, and to note, however involuntarily, his idiosyncrasies and affectations. It would have undone the magic. But my landlord, in addition to his literary value to Alan as material, someone from an earlier age, was the one person to whom Alan stood almost in a position of authority. To my landlord, recently recovered from his aesthesia, Alan was still an adventurer in the titillating world from which he, my landlord, had withdrawn. My landlord was the one person to whom Alan could bring news. And yet their meetings would have been few and wouldn't have lasted long. From Mr. Phillips I heard that my landlord tired quickly of conversation and people, social encounters, that he could suddenly become restless and dismiss even old friends. I heard, indirectly, from the Phillipses that Alan usually ate alone in the manor. And the picture that came to my mind was not of a tray being taken to Alan's room, but of a dim ceiling bulb lighting a modest spread on an old lace tablecloth in a musty room smelling of old cedar and wood preservative. So the solitude I saw was indeed solitude. And if Alan thought it creepy that I could live in the place for so long without getting to know my landlord, I thought it strange, until I understood the particular solace the place offered him, that he should want to visit, for the reasons he gave, to be in the place important to his childhood, for the sake of the novel he was working on or planning, and also, for the sake of another book, to be in the presence of my landlord, to study his speech and mannerisms, the mannerisms of a more gracious age, the age before the deluge, not the age that had finished in 1914, this time, but the age according to Alan that had finished in 1940, the age when houses like my landlord's were still important, not only socially but also in the making of literary and artistic reputations. Alan suggested that in spite of his apparent idleness, his rambling about the orchard and gardens, his readiness to come to my cottage at any time, his visits to the manor were periods of work, that he was taking away volumes of notes. Sometimes he let me into the secret of the notes he was making or had made. My landlord had said to him once, "Would you like some toast? Shall I get Phillips to bring you some toast in a chafing dish?" And Alan had roared with laughter as much as he had roared at the story about Piton and the pink champagne. "A chafing dish," he said. "Have you heard anybody speak of a chafing dish?" So that I felt not only that Alan, like me, 25 years before in Earl's Court, had a good idea of what as a writer he expected to find, but also that my landlord, even in his shrunken world, and through the darkness of his aesthesia, still had an idea of what was expected of him. But there was Alan's solitude, so visible in the manner, so clear in the melancholy of his knobby little face when he was caught unawares. That solitude was real enough, as real as the pain of his childhood, as real as the aesthesia of my landlord and the physical dereliction this aesthesia had created all around him. That solitude of Alan's as he walked about the garden and grounds was like a demonstration of the psychological damage he had suffered once upon a time. There was a part of him that hurt, a part where he could never be reached and where he was always alone, and the nature of his education, his too literary approach to his experience, his admiration of certain writers and artists of the century, his wish to do again, but for himself, what they had done, all this conspired to conceal things from himself. The solitude of the manor grounds was a solace. Outside that was threat and the vision of his own inadequacy. He made up for this by flattery of the people he admired and whose strength he wished he had. Like a child offering sweets to his fellows in order to buy peace, Alan told many people he was making notes about them for his big book about contemporary literature. He was keeping his eye on so many people, noting their conversation, keeping their letters. He was going to write about so many people. And it was hard, once Alan had told you he was making notes about you, to ignore him, hard not to start acting up, even like my landlord, to an intelligent, friendly man who might indeed be making notes about all the things you were saying. He balanced this by a contempt for those writers in whom he saw versions of himself, mimics, people doing what others had done in social chronicles and wishing to show that they could do it too. Towards these writers, whose faults he saw very clearly, he was merciless. One such writer, he was physically bigger than Alan, but was also something of a dandy in clothes, whom I saw in London, told me. The venomous little insect came galumphing across the room at Clarissa's and said to me, "My dear, you must stay in this Saturday and listen to the critics. I've slaughtered you." Ha ha! But there were not many people like that, people to whom Alan expressed open hostility. The public objects of Alan's dislike were mainly certain kinds of buildings, paintings, gardens, flowers. And here even my landlord was not exempt. My landlord liked gladioli. Pitton grew them for him in the garden. Alan hated them for their gaudiness and size. He said, closing his eyes, a shudder going right through him. They should be that high, bending and holding his open palm down to the level of his shin. He could shudder with distaste like this when he spoke of these things, flowers, pictures, buildings, as though making up, in the violence of his aesthetic responses, for all the coyness he imposed on himself with other people, all the talk about notes, and the writing he was preparing to do about them. "All this is going down in the diary," he would say, or, personalizing it, "This is for diary," or, "Diary will take due note." All the sweets he offered the world to buy peace. It was this aesthetic violence, at bottom quite genuine, reflecting a genuine sensibility, a true concern for the life of the mind, that gave his radio talks and discussions their bite and attack and suggested that they were the merest glimpse of a fuller life and more prodigious personality. It happened sometimes that months passed without our meeting. He might not come down, or I might be away when he did come down. One day, quite unusually, he telephoned me from London, and I was aware only then that I hadn't seen him for perhaps a year or more. There were the sounds of music in the background. The music was very loud. It made me ask where he was telephoning from. It was from his flat. He said, "You talk like my neighbors. Of course I am blasting away." And he gave his great, choking laugh. The old Alan, it would have seemed. But it wasn't. He was drunk, and as he began to speak, it became clear that he was very drunk. Alcohol and music, the supports of solitude. This was new to me, not the solitude, but the drinking. I had never thought of Alan as a drinking man. But even drunkenness didn't alter Alan's character or show the other side of the man. Drunkenness didn't liberate him. It exaggerated, made ludicrous, his appeasing public character. Hardly able to control his words, he was seeking only to send messages of love, to flatter, to speak to me about my work. And he was asking nothing in return. For there was, as it were, no means of getting back to the person from whom all this issued. The person that wished to buy peace from the world was beyond the reach of the world, was hardly known, it might be said, to Alan himself. It didn't matter how much one flattered back, it didn't matter how much love one sent back, one could never touch the true person. Some months later he reappeared at the manor. He had greatly changed. His eyes, once so seemingly unreliable and shifty, had become dead, lackluster. There was a very old sadness there. The knobby little face had become white and soft. It had become like the face of a frail old woman. And it was as if this transformation gave a glimpse of the ambiguity in the personality, perhaps just one of the many ambiguities that had tormented Alan. Especially noticeable to me was the skin of his cheeks. It was very white and seemed to have become very thin, seemed to flutter above the flesh, as though there was some vacancy between skin and flesh, whenever Alan spoke or closed his mouth too firmly. This thin, delicate skin made me think of the outer petal of a blown rose. It seemed to have something of the texture. It made me think also of the faded black plastic sheeting that covered the old cottage-shaped hayrick on the driveway. Plastic sheeting so beaten about by wind and rain that it had not only lost its luster and snap but appeared also to have developed within its thinness little blisters and air pockets. The man had changed. And he was in my cottage, sitting in my wing chair, half reclined, looking small, the upholstered wings above his head, his knees neatly together. It was a little as if, this was the idea that came to me, the man that one knew had been subjected almost to a moral attack by the unacknowledged personality within, that the man had been pulled down by this inner personality, which now sat like a watchful guardian on the man's shoulder, and was the only entity with whom Alan could now have a true dialogue. Of the old personality there remained only the clothes that made the upholstery of the chair look grimy. These clothes were as carefully chosen as ever, but the man within was so quiet, so little ebullient, his movements were so slow and considered, that the clothes did not suggest the old personality. From the Phillipses I later heard about the drunken telephone calls Alan had made to the manor at about the time, or perhaps a little before, he had telephoned me. The first 3 or 4 had been taken. But then, perhaps Alan had pushed his luck too far, had begun to make the telephone calls at odd hours, perhaps had said things he hadn't said to me. My landlord had become alarmed. Alan's disturbance, so manifest, had given my landlord fresh glimpses of his own aesthesia again, his own hell. To fear that kind of illness was, in effect, to start being ill again. And for a while my landlord had had a relapse. Alan's telephone calls had been refused. Mr. Phillips had ordered Alan not to telephone again. Alan had been forbidden to come to the house. All Mr. Phillips's protective feelings towards his employer, the sick man, were awakened. The prohibition on Alan's visits was lifted only when Mr. Phillips was sure that Alan had stopped drinking. But the man who had reappeared in the manor was ravaged. That old lady's face was the face of a man beyond cure. And though he refused the glass of wine I offered, quite innocently, not knowing at the time his recent history, though he refused, while insisting, with beautiful courtesy, almost as though he were my host, that I should have a glass myself, his apparent cure was, as with some other bad diseases, only a remission, enabling him, perhaps cruelly, perhaps in a spirit of reconciliation, to look at the world he was leaving and to say his goodbyes. He said goodbye. He never came back. I heard him once or twice on the radio, as bubbling as ever. If only he could have lived there, at that pitch, in something like a radio studio atmosphere, something of that artificial social arrangement, instead of having to go home and be alone. And then one day I heard, some days after the event, that he had taken some pills one night after a bout of hard drinking and died. It was a theatrical kind of death. Theater would not have been far from Alan's mind that evening. It might so easily have gone the other way. Somebody might have telephoned, or he might have telephoned somebody, gone to a party in brilliant clothes, been witty or flattering or outrageous, would have ridden over the theatrical moment of suicide. But his solitude would almost certainly have brought him there again. The news was kept from my landlord. Mr. Phillips thought it would be bad for him to be told. But somehow my landlord found out. For him it was one person less in his shrinking world, another person not to be mentioned again. Of Alan's books and notes, there was of course almost nothing. Out of his love for the life of the mind, and the artist's eye and hand, he had flattered very many people. And it was this flattery that was his odd memorial for a week or so. A number of people who wrote about Alan after his death wrote with that part of their personalities that had almost been created by Alan's flattery. Their obituaries were curiously self-regarding, as much as to Alan, who came out in these notices as an eccentric, an anachronism, someone from before the deluge. The words were actually used in one piece. These people paid tribute to themselves for having known and befriended Alan, for having spotted his talent and sensibility, having been singled out by him for his confidences, his confessions of sadness. No one spoke of his flattery. And more than one person, it turned out, had been telephoned by Alan in distress just a few days before he had died. Mr. Phillips, mentioning Alan's death, permitted himself a look of sadness, a twinge of regret. But then almost immediately his face clouded with the irritability which I thought of as his usual public expression. This irritability was like Bray's peaked cap. It enabled Mr. Phillips to express many things. He could wear his irritability dead straight, or he could wear it mockingly or self-mockingly. He could use it to express authority, or to be an aggrieved worker, or it could be the irritability of a man protecting his good fortune, not wishing to exult. Now his irritability bridged his human response to the death of Alan and his professional pride as a male nurse and as protector of the manor. He had spotted Alan immediately, he said. He had spotted Alan's depressive nature. He had been right to forbid Alan the house. The drunkenness would simply not have done. Its effect on my landlord would have been calamitous, and then Alan could so easily have done in the manor what he had done at home. Think of the trouble, the confusion, the further effect on my landlord, holding on to the remnants of his own lucidity and health. That was how he, Alan, was remembered at the place which he thought of as his special retreat. I telephoned Phillips and have him meet me at the station. That was how, in one mood, Alan thought or wanted to think of his time and position at the manor. It was half a social idea, half a literary idea, the being met at the station. With all its old-fashioned country house weekend suggestions, the use of the name Phillips without the Mr., though Alan called Mr. Phillips Stanley or Stan and Mr. Phillips called him Alan. Mr. Phillips's old father said to me, "So your friend Alan died. Nice man. I hardly knew him. I saw him a few times. He was always very pleasant." He, old Mr. Phillips, the small, neat man, had been walking in the grounds with his tall pronged staff, the sign that he had come to the grounds to walk and not to work. He was carefully dressed, in his very pale colors, no pattern in the fabric of his tie, jacket, or shirt, this absence of pattern together with the broad lapels, collars, and ties of the period adding to the pallor of the clothes, suggesting chalk below the tints, the way the chalk of the downs modified the color of young grass or corn and in dry weather whitened a plowed field. The old man said, "Whenever I hear something like this I think of my cousin. He died when he was 8. In 1911, coronation year. We were standing outside my cottage, below the beeches." The old man slightly lifted his face. He was smiling. His eyes were watering. I knew the expression. The smile wasn't a smile, the tears were not tears. It was just what happened to his face whenever he began to talk about his childhood, or early life. But he couldn't tell me about his cousin just then. We were both distracted by a great squawking noise. The noise was made by a flock of rooks circling overhead. Big black beaks, big black flapping wings. I had never seen them here before. I had got used to starlings arriving suddenly in screeching flocks, settling like black leaves on trees. But rooks in this number I hadn't seen. They flew around slowly, squawking, as if assessing us. In my first year, on one of my early, exploratory walks, I had seen 2 or 3 downs away, on a wooded hill on the other side of Jack's cottage, spread-eagled husks of these birds nailed to a fence by Jack's very old and bent father-in-law. Old Mr. Phillips said, "They've lost their nests right through the valley. They lost their nests when the elms died. They're prospecting. They need tall trees. They'll choose the beeches. You know what they say about rooks? They bring money to a house. Money is coming to somebody in the manor. Who do you think it's going to be? Of course it's an old wise tale. Old wise tale." It was what he said, and the idiom, as he spoke it, with its irony and tolerance, sounded original rather than a corruption. If you think they're birds of death you can't stand the noise. If you think it's money you don't mind. And in that noise of the squawking, prospecting rooks, the old man told me about the death he had not forgotten, the first death against which he measured all other deaths, the grief that was more painful than any other and was still with him more than 65 years later. He and his cousin were skylarking. They ran behind a horse-drawn van belonging to a local firm. They jumped on the nose bags that were slung on the rear axle. The driver didn't see them. They rode on the nose bags for a mile or 2, eating apples. Then they got bored. They got off. A motorcar, unusual for those days, came along the road, kicking up white dust that lay an inch or 2 thick on the unpaved country road. Both boys were involved in the white dust cloud. Bizarrely then, another car came along and old Mr. Phillips saw his cousin knocked down. It was the only thing he could see, and he was frightened. He ran to the river bank and hid in a bed of withies until mid-afternoon. From there he saw the dust cloud settle. He saw his aunt, his cousin's mother, come. He saw the boy taken away in an ambulance to the military hospital. The army was here even in those days. There the boy died. No one thought of flogging old Mr. Phillips. That worry had been with him. In his aunt's house that evening he saw the body of his cousin, with whom he had been riding that morning, laid out. "These things strike you afterwards," the old man said. The funeral was the next day. "His little coffin," old Mr. Phillips said, and now real tears for that death more than 65 years before were running down his face. Then he pulled himself up, altered his tone. "No, not little. Fair-sized coffin. My aunt asked me and the other boys to collect moss. That was how I spent the day of the funeral. Gathering moss. It was to put in the grave, to soften the whiteness of the chalk in the sun. It's what the undertakers still do. They hang a mat, green and looking like grass, down the sides of the grave. Of course they come back later, after the mourners have gone, and take it away. The wet river banks, the downs, everyone saw different things. Old Mr. Phillips, with his memories of chalk and moss, my landlord, loving ivy, the builders of the manor garden, Alan, Jack, me. The rooks, prospecting, made such a racket that I wondered how I would endure it. Another sound to be added to the noise of airplanes at certain hours in the day, the artillery barrages on some nights from the firing ranges, the sound of which made one conceive of air as a substance, elastic up to a point, and beyond that point liable to puncture. The end-of-day traffic increasing year by year and coming to my cottage through a thinning screen of beeches and yews. But the racket of that day was unusual. The squawks of the big birds, flapping slowly around, were like the squawks of discussion. When the discussion and the prospecting were over, the birds went away. And when the first party of settlers, the first nest builders, came, they built only one nest. It was as though they were testing the trees, the site, the people. The rocky or pebbled lane below the beeches was littered with lengths of pliable twigs, material for the nest, fallen and useless, suggesting that for every twig successfully knitted into the nest 3 or 4 or 5 had been lost. At last it appeared, on the upper part of a beech, one rook's nest. There was a pause then, long enough to make one feel that there would be no more rook's nests in those winter-stripped beeches. But then, very quickly, there appeared a second, and a third, and then many more big dark burrs high up, beyond the reach of predators, and soon to be hidden by the foliage of the spring and summer. From the train to London, through Wiltshire and Hampshire, I saw the same colonization going on, rook's nests appearing where there hadn't been any. The elms had finally died in the valley. Many, before they had finally died, had been felled, cut up, others had died standing up, remaining bare, going grayer against the summer green. And the valley road became suddenly open. Curves once overhung with green, mysterious and full of depth, showed plain, till downs, without a border of elms and wild growth between the elms, sloped down simply to the asphalt road. House plots showed plain, and houses and their ancillary little corrugated sheds looked naked. The shallow river and its wet banks remained enchanting, but the land on either side became ordinary. And time altered for me. At first, as in childhood, it had stretched. The first spring had contained so much that was clear and sharp, the moss rose, the single blue iris, the peonies under my window. I had waited for the year to repeat. Then memories began to be jumbled, time began to race, the years began to stack together, it began to be hard for me to date things. Bray, the car hire man, once the neighbor of Pitton, the gardener, whose house had been bought for a price that had a sobering effect on Bray, by a young surveyor with a Salisbury practice, Bray began to talk to me of religion. Was that before or after the rooks came? Before or after the discovery of the young vagrant who had been camping for some time in the manor grounds? He had been living, this man, in the children's house in the overgrown orchard, near Pitton's garden. Refuge. There had been wanderers in previous summers, but this man was one of the many new itinerants, not gypsies now, but young city people, some of them criminals, who moved about Wiltshire and Somerset in old cars and vans and caravans looking for festivals, communities, camping sites. The discovery of this man created alarm. It would have been easy for others to follow him, and for knowledge of the children's house to spread. So at last, 60 or 70 years after it had been built, the children's house, seldom used by the children for whom it had been intended, and still more or less whole, even though its thatch had slipped in one place, was closed, its door and windows nailed up and barred with timber planks. And, as a further deterrent, Mr. Phillips had the round building wound about with barbed wire. Like the closing of the wide white gate at the end of the lawn after Pitton left, and the piling up of dead branches on the inside of the gate, to keep the gate closed, this abandoning of the children's house was an event. But I couldn't date it. The order that Pitton had imposed not only on the grounds but also on my idea of the seasons, that order had gone. I no longer had that order to set events against, events which now, as time raced, became jumbled, even the coming of the rooks, even the talk from Bray of religion. As much as any comparable area of Egypt or India, the region, once a vast burial place, was full of sacred sites, the circles of wood or stone, the great burial mounds, the medieval cathedrals and abbeys, and the churches that were often no less grand. And faith hadn't stopped there. Scattered about these monuments, cultural shrines, and side by side with them sometimes, were relics of more recent ways of worship. In the center of Salisbury, across a narrow pedestrian lane from a well-known cake shop, there was a magnificently windowed Gothic church. On the wall of the chancel at the far end, and just below the roof, there was a primitive painting of Doomsday, the colors of the painting magenta and green, both faded, with naked medieval figures in heaven on the left, hell on the right, the quality of the painting and the knowledge of anatomy appearing to match the quality of medieval mind and soul, men naked in a world beyond their control. The wings of the consoling angels as fearful and unnatural as the bird or reptile swallowing the damned. Opposite this monument of medieval piety was the busy cake shop, the inner room of which had been a Victorian Sunday school. A carved stone slab, like an escutcheon, recorded this fact and the date of the foundation of the school in Victorian Gothic characters. Gatto and quiche and coffee at varnished pine tables in a room where not long before children had learned Bible stories and hymns and respect. In one of the river valleys outside Salisbury, at the top of a footpath running up from the river, there was still a small, one-roomed mission hut. It was a rough shed of timber and corrugated iron and had perhaps been built just before the First World War. There had been as much pride and religion in its plainness then as there had been medieval awe and medieval grandeur. Now the hut was without a function. Further along the road on this side of the river there was a red brick building with Victorian Gothic windows. This building was still marked at the top Wesleyan Chapel. It had ceased to be that a long time ago. It was now a private house, the Victorian Gothic arches and lettering part of its unusual character as a dwelling place. Quite different, and not only because it was still in use as a church, was the renovated parish church near the manor and my cottage. This church was an age away from the religious anxiety of the Doomsday painting of St. Thomas's in Salisbury, the sense of an arbitrary world, full of terrors, where men were naked and helpless and only God gave protection. The parish church had been renovated at the time the great Victorian houses and manors of the region were being built. And it was of that confident period. As much as a faith, it celebrated a culture, a national pride, a power, men very much in control of their destinies. That was still its atmosphere, though the people it attracted were now, in terms of wealth, lesser than the Victorian magnates, less predominating, and though their houses were like the small change of the great Victorian dwellings. The very scantiness of the parish church congregation, enough now for only one service a month rather than one a week, supported the idea of an enclosed, excluding cultural celebration, the sound of car doors, the gentle chatter before and after the service, with him singing in the interim to the sounds of an organ, still there in the little church, still working, muffled by the thick renovated walls of stone and flint in a checkered pattern. No room for Jack there, Jack who celebrated life while he lived. No room for Mr. Phillips or for the strange, townish people who came now to do a few hours' rough work in the manor garden. And no room, I would have thought, for the old Bray, the man of puzzling views, a mixture of high conservatism and wild republicanism, a worship of the rich, the users of his cars, with a hatred of inherited wealth and titles. The old Wesleyan chapel, as a private dwelling extended, with matching Gothic windows, the empty mission hut, the Victorian Sunday school now part of the cake shop, that was the 19th century popular religion which, lingering into the 20th, had partly made people like Bray the religion of constriction and discipline rather than celebration. That was the constriction that Bray, and thousands like him, had grown out of. That was why those relics of recent Christianity dotted the region. So many kinds of religion here, so many relics. But now, Bray talked of religion. It crept up on me, the talk. I wasn't aware of how seriously he was speaking when he spoke of the good book. I barely took it in, heard it simply as part of his chattering everyday irony. I sat beside him in his car, had a sideways glimpse of his peaked cap and the slope and slit of his eyes squinting at the road. The squint and slit, the set of his face, and what I knew of his temperament led me to feel that he was joking. I had associated his appearance and manner for too long with the man who spoke glibly and cynically about politicians, certain members of the royal family, trades unions, businessmen in the news or in the courts, and every other kind of passing topic. Like the new pound note, for instance, introduced by a Labour government, and rejected by him purely for that reason. I call it Mickey Mouse money. He had probably heard somebody say that. With Bray it was the combination of the views that was original. The views themselves, as I found again and again, were borrowed from radio or television programs, popular newspapers. As soon as I understood that he was speaking in earnest, my vision of him changed. In the same features, the same way of speaking, I saw not the glibness of his cynicism but personal feeling and, soon, passion. I thought later that there would have been another reason why it took me some time to understand that Bray was speaking seriously when he spoke of religion. It was that he was learning himself, that he was being inducted into some new doctrine which he had accepted without fully understanding, and had then had to learn about. A new doctrine, because the religion Bray had embraced was not the religion of the Victorian relics which he and thousands with him had rejected. The religion that emerged from his talk, the religion into which he was sinking week by week, had to do with healing, or more specifically a healer, a wise person, the sex of the person concealed by Bray, a Bible opened at random during a service, the words on the pages interpreted, the kneeling believers receiving each a personal message, personal guidance. A healer, meetings around a Bible as a sacred object, shared food, a hint of companionship, even conviviality, in piety. This talk of meetings made me think of a spiritualist gathering I had gone to in a North London suburb 20 years before, out of interest, seeing the sensational meetings so matter-of-factly advertised outside the red brick building, and also in the hope of finding copy for a 5-minute radio talk for one of the magazine programs of the BBC Overseas Services. It was in an upstairs room, reached directly by steps from the pavement. The lamp above the entrance was marked simply Hall. Most of the people waiting inside were regulars. Among them were some children, healthy, playful, a little restless. They sat in the front row. The medium was a heavy, ordinary, middle-aged woman. She apologized for being late. She said she had had to travel from somewhere south of the river. Very briskly then she started. There were messages for all of us. There was even one for me, from my grandfather, who was very far away, the medium said, and whose voice came only faintly to her. But most terrible were the messages for the children, 3 or 4 of them, so handsome and well cared for, with their restless feet. These messages were preceded by the medium clutching at her throat and saying that she was choking, could hardly breathe. And the woman with the children, clearly their mother, gravely and without anguish, leaning forward, she sat in the row behind the children, nodded, as if to corroborate the identity of the spirit who was transmitting this message. Her husband, the father of the children, had been hanged. And I never got to know, I never asked the person who had told me, whether the father had been hanged by the state, in England or abroad, or had hanged himself. Every fortnight now the hangman's family came to have this communion with him, which no doubt explained their composure. They were believers. There was a simple message for each child: help mummy, be good at school, and each child waited for his or her message, and became grave when the message came. What memories they would retain of these visits! New characters, new passions, were being given them, to separate them from their fellows. 20, 30 years from then, those characters, in adult bodies and with adult needs, would act out those passions. Something of that chill of 20 years before came to me when Bray talked to me of his meetings. He himself was as composed as the children and wife of the hanged man 20 years before. They had been driven by a dreadful need, clear for all to see. What was the need that had driven Bray? He was so full of talk, so opinionated, so full of noise, that I hadn't stopped to think about the satisfactions or otherwise of his life. A married daughter lived in Devon, where she had moved after her husband had found a piece of ground. Bray's words, she never came back to visit. Bray gave many reasons when he first mentioned the fact, but then he gave none. What did she have to come back to? And thinking of Bray in this way, attempting to see him from the point of view of the daughter who had resolved to stay away, I had another idea of the man, saw how overpowering he might be, how constricting life in his house could be. And this new idea of Bray was added to the idea of the man with memories of the fields full of laborers at harvest time, of allowances of beer, of children taking tea to their fathers and grandfathers, the man with his undisclosed memory obtained from his short holiday job as a boy in the manor, his wish to be independent, combined with his unwitting possession, as a servant, someone trained to please, of 3 or 4 characters. I had sensed a little of his instability. But what had now befallen him? From what I heard, in those meetings, in some town on the south coast, and in this sharing of food, this communion, Bray had joined people whom the radical conservative in him despised, workers, people looking for employment, the kind of person he, Bray, the self-employed man, celebrating his freedom after his father's and grandfather's lifetime of servitude, looked down on. The man who scoffed at Pitton, exulted in his fall, now showed sympathy for people like Pitton, people for whom in England, even in this well-to-do part of England, there was no longer room, people coming down from the Midlands and finding themselves dispossessed, without lodgings or security, people, unlike the naked souls in the doomsday painting in St. Thomas's, who knew what it was to be in charge of their fates, but felt they had lost control. The more I heard about Bray's meetings, the more I thought of that London meeting of 20 years before. And the scene reconstructed itself in one detail after another, down to the lamp-painted hall shining palely in the quiet street, quiet at night in that part of residential London in those days, with few people out and very few cars. So ordinary and dull the street, so desperate the people up there, in the room at the top of the tall flight of stairs. "It's as with everything else," Bray said. "You can take out only what you put in. The more you put in, the more you take out. The good book is always open for you." From Mrs. Bray I heard more. She was someone I hardly knew. I knew her mainly as a voice on the telephone. She answered the telephone when Bray was out and made the bookings for him. He telephoned her regularly when he was out. She was brisk, Bray's instructions, to save his customers' telephone charges. She was efficient. No extra talk there. A cheerful little voice on the telephone, its possessor hardly seen. She lived in her house. There was no garden. Bray's paved yard left little space for anything like that. She was driven into Salisbury or Andover by Bray to do her shopping. She seldom took the bus. Sometimes Bray, in the car, greeted her in Salisbury. Then I saw her, a very small, thin woman, a wisp of a woman, hardly there, as though life with Bray, the driver, the mechanic, the man with strong views, the hard worker, the perverse neglecter of the valley's beauty, had worn her down. It was from her, now, that I heard more of Bray's religion and meetings. I can't answer for him these days. He's at one of his meetings, I expect. He's emptied the deep freeze. That's how I know. That's not the way you treat a deep freeze. I don't understand him. If you have a deep freeze, you build it up. You don't keep emptying it. I had heard about the deep freeze from Bray. It was important to him. I didn't have one myself, and he delighted in telling me about the rituals connected with it. The bulk buying, and at reduced prices from certain shops, apparently, the cooking and the storing of great batches, the deep freeze made food the center of a new kind of ritual, provided a new kind of shopping, a new kind of excursion, restored an idea of plenty and harvest time and celebration. Mrs. Bray had her own ideas. Towards the deep freeze she was more squirrel-like, hoarding, wishing to keep the granary full. And when one day I met her at the bus stop, Unusually, she was usually driven by Bray to Salisbury or Amesbury or Andover or to some special discount supermarket on the outskirts of Southampton. She was still inflamed about the deep freeze. So small, so thin, so inflamed. She said, the rooks cawing and flapping above us. If you have a deep freeze, you build it up. You don't keep emptying it. She spoke as though, in an ideal world, she would keep her deep freeze full forever and never touch it. She spoke as though, in spite of the manifest hardships, the absence of Bray and a car, the replenishing of the deep freeze was the purpose of her trip to Salisbury. She repeated, "You build it up." At the end of the road, no longer hidden at its far end by the elms and the growth at the roadside between the elms, the red bus appeared. She waited until the bus almost stopped. She said, "It's that fancy woman of his." The words burst out of her. As though the arrival of the bus, the sudden darkening of the bus stop area, the folding door opening back, the noise of the engine, had provided her with the correct dramatic moment for the disclosure, the abandoning of civility, and talking about things she didn't absolutely have on her mind. And having taken her inflamed mood up several degrees, she stamped into the bus, slapped her coins down on the driver's little stand, and generally did as much as she could to draw attention to herself and her anger. She sat in one of the front seats. Such fuss, such commotion from such a small person, and paid no further attention to me. And I wondered whether in 1950, when I was 18 and new to England, new to adult life, I wondered whether, seeing a woman of that age in a bus behaving in such a way, I would have thought it even likely that the anger of a woman so old and small and white-haired would have had to do with her husband's fancy woman. The words, coming from that little lady, were shocking to me. I had known her for so long as a friendly, brisk voice on the telephone, knowing my voice and taking pleasure in anticipating my name before I spoke it. "Can do, will do, thank you, sir." Those were the words, spoken swiftly on the telephone, to prevent me from having to put in new coins I associated with her. Fancy woman was awful, demeaning to her, demeaning to the woman she was talking about, if such a woman existed, demeaning to her husband, demeaning, the way obscenities of speech are demeaning, to all of us. And it was of this other woman that I now heard from Mrs. Bray, on the telephone, at the bus stop, where she began to appear more often, and in the shopping streets of Salisbury. How had Bray met this other woman? Who would be attracted to Bray? I had never thought of Bray as a partner for anyone, but that was a man's way of looking. In this business of sensing or seeing partners, a woman would live in a different world. In the beginning I had had my doubts about the existence of this woman. But then, quite quickly, from Mrs. Bray's circumstantial stories, I believed there was a woman, and from Mrs. Bray's stories I could see the point up to which Bray had directly and innocently spoken about the woman, speaking of the oddity of the meeting with her, as he might have spoken of any other oddity connected with his taxi work. She had arrived late one night at Salisbury railway station on a slow train from the south. Only a few details, in Mrs. Bray's stories, of the age and appearance of this woman, and I had no idea whether all these details had formed part of Bray's story as he had told it to Mrs. Bray. She had told the ticket collector that she had no ticket, no money, no place to spend the night. He or a colleague had telephoned the police. They, the curious, taken for granted humanity of the British state and its officials, arranged for the woman to be put up in a bed and breakfast place for the night. A decision about what was to be done with her was to be taken by higher officers the next day. The bed and breakfast place was run by a man supplementing his poor income from his original business, a picture-framing junk shop antique shop. It was at the request of the police, or a policeman then, that Bray, the fair, the reliable, and ready for a job at any time of day or night, had gone to the railway station and taken the woman to the bed and breakfast place. That must have made an impression on him, the bright lights of the station, its near emptiness, the solitude of the woman. But it was the next day that his feelings were engaged, when in the morning he had gone to the place to take the woman to the police station. As she came down the short paved path from the front door he saw, as he had told Mrs. Bray, the rotten, spotty complexion of the woman, the overbig tweed overcoat, clearly somebody else's, she had on, the general manner of the dropouts or traveling people of the neighborhood whom he so disliked. But then suddenly, as he had told Mrs. Bray, when she had come out past the wicket gate onto the pavement, she had turned on him with anger, sarcasm, scorn. And she, narrow, close-set eyes, had said, almost shouted, to him, "But I have no money, you know." Mrs. Bray reported the woman's sarcasm with a sarcasm of her own. But it was possible, even with this, to see how Bray would have been taken aback and to see how, in the very aggression of the woman, the spirit she showed at that particular moment, he would have found an attraction, would have fallen for her weakness, her need, her dependence on him at that moment. She had then said to him with a continuation of her hostility and pride, which clearly at the same time contained an appeal to someone she had seen faltering, "You know where they'll be sending me back to, don't you?" Not jail. If it had been, Bray wouldn't have responded. It was a kind of county home for people with nervous disorders. And in that grown woman there was something of the child who still expected its pleas to move adults, to move others. That was what Bray had told Mrs. Bray. There his direct, early story stopped. And the reason was that for that wounded, appealing child in that woman's body, for that soul imprisoned behind those eyes, Bray had felt an immense passion, and all the protectiveness of his nature. Whenever I thought of the woman in Bray, I thought of those sentences. Mrs. Bray spoke them often, the only intimacy of the couple to which she had been admitted. "But I have no money, you know. You know where they'll be sending me back to, don't you?" He didn't take her to the police station, didn't get her involved in any paperwork there. He offered to keep her at the bed and breakfast place. He knew the man, the junk shop man who had begun his business as a picture framer, and called his shop a gallery. This man had been like so many others, shopkeepers or would-be shopkeepers, who had been attracted to Salisbury for the sake of its civility and wealth and countryside, but hadn't sufficiently studied the pattern of its traffic, the location of the car parks, the very roundabout one-way street system, or understood the way shoppers moved about the town center. A shop might be just 2 or 3 minutes' walk from the market square, but could be off the main shopping track. Many little businesses failed, quickly, visibly. Especially pathetic were the shops that, not understanding that people with important shopping to do usually did it in London, aimed at style. How dismal those boutiques and women's dress shops quickly became, the hysteria of their owners showing in their windows. Not in the turbulence or disorder of their display but in the opposite, a melancholy unassertiveness, not the unassertiveness of good taste or old-fashionedness, but something more like a nervous condition, as though the window wished it didn't have to be seen, this unassertiveness of the window like an expression of the owner's wish to abandon the project, run away. No longer the swag of the fisherman's net with plastic starfish or painted wooden fish or real shells, or the bits of driftwood, or the autumn leaves. Nothing like that now, more like a laundry sale, a sale of unreclaimed items, just the garments, the skirts and the blouses, things unloved, even by the keeper of the shop, who could be glimpsed sometimes, when the light was right and the window did not reflect the street, in the middle of her dwindling, much-handled stock, vacant, grumpy, unwelcoming, she who at the beginning had been all charm and a wish to please, offering civilities. A cup of coffee, perhaps, or classical music over and above the civilities of simple trade, now seemingly anxious to drive everyone away, to fail utterly, to have no possible encouragement or excuse for reopening her shop. All just a few yards away from boom and success and the tramp of tourist feet. It was above a shop like this, a picture framer's, a gallery, that Bray's woman stayed. There wasn't the demand in Salisbury for the amount of picture framing the shop needed, and the shop didn't have the stock of frames or mounts to attract such business as was going. Brackets of 10 or 12 picture frame styles, elegantly sliced off at the diagonal, hung over pegs, like little decorated gallows. Those picture frame samples, quickly lost amid the second-hand furniture and household goods, the junk or antique trade, to which the shop had turned, until even this had been subsumed in the bed and breakfast business that the hard-pressed owner had started on the 2 upper floors. It was here, through the woman or girl, or through the bed and breakfast man, that Bray had got to find out about the healer and the meetings. And as fast as he had learned about the healing, so he had talked to me about what he had learned. In the beginning he hadn't talked with great knowledge. That was one reason why I took some time to understand that he was talking seriously. Gradually, then, there came out an account of his new religious life, the healing sessions, the good book, opened at random for each one in turn, and its words interpreted. Gradually, there came out, too, the new idea of community he had found and surrendered to, the discovery of people wounded in their minds and hearts, for whom the material world had proved too much, had passed out of control. Not the arbitrary medieval world of the doomsday painting in St. Thomas's. That was a world men had never understood or thought they could control. In that world men could get by only by appeasing, making sacrifice, performing rituals. In this healing world of Bray's it was different. As in the ancient Roman world at the very beginning of Christianity, the grief and the communion came from the feeling that the world had once been under control, but was so no longer. And at the center of this tenderness and compassion was the woman he had seen at the railway station, who had the very next day thrown herself on his mercy, the woman who was totally dependent on him. Of her appearance I gathered nothing more than I had already heard: the overbig tweed coat, the lank hair, the unhappy, close-set eyes, the bad skin. This was what Bray had reported to Mrs. Bray the first day, and the next. That was all Mrs. Bray had to go by. That was all she had to embroider on. I thought that part of the woman's attraction for Bray would have been the absence of an overt allure. Allure in the woman might have made Bray uneasy, might have made him feel he was being used. It might have given him the idea that there were or could have been other men in the picture. In the woman he had found there was only a child's need in a cruel world, and to that need Bray would have thought that he alone was responsive. And from time to time in those aggressive, unhappy eyes there might have been an acknowledgement of Bray's ability to protect. Mrs. Bray said of Bray, "If I told the taxi union or the council where he got his fancy woman from, I suppose they would take away his license." I didn't think her power would run that far. I didn't think she thought so herself, and I don't believe she wanted any harm to come to Bray. It was his new serenity that enraged her. As far as he was concerned, he behaved as though there were no quarrels at home. And perhaps there were none. Perhaps Mrs. Bray's rages were for people like me, who might have known about Bray's other life. But it was only from Mrs. Bray that I heard about the woman. From Bray I heard only about the healing and the meetings. His meetings took up more of his time. There were certain afternoons and evenings now when he was not free, but apart from that his taxi driving, car hire life continued as before. He said to me one day in the car, after a silence which he had allowed to happen, perhaps to give greater effect to his words, "I've taken up tithing." He spoke the words with pride, boastfulness, pleasure. It was like the time he had spoken from the corner of his mouth about Pitton's departure and from the dashboard shelf had handed me, with an air of mystery and favor, the book my landlord had published in the 1920s. Tithing. Such an old word. The tenth of one's produce for the church. Such a subject for radical protest. Perhaps even in the Middle Ages, when men lived in the world of the St. Thomas's doomsday painting, it had been resisted. But now Bray, a hater of privilege and taxation, boasted of offering his tithe to his healer, spoke of tithing as though he had toiled up to the top of the hill and seen the fine view. He said, "And that has to be before tax, you understand. I give a tenth of my gross. It hurts. Of course it hurts. It's meant to hurt. You have to make the sacrifice." And then, not knowing that from his wife I had been given an idea of the person he was talking about, he said, "There's someone I know. Started a little second-hand business. Didn't do well. Began taking in foreign students. French, German. We get a lot of those here. But that didn't do well either. The agencies wanted the students to stay with families. He was ready to put his head in the oven. Then he began tithing. It hurt. It was like the last straw. But he kept at it. And you know what? In the last 2 months the Social Security had been sending him people. For the first time for a couple of years he's making regular money. As Churchill said during the war, there's a tide in the affairs of men. It goes out. But it also comes back in. It's the same with tithing. You get back only what you put in. It has to hurt. Then you get double. So, beneath the noisy rooks, whose arrival portended death or money, according to the old wise tales, as Mr. Phillips's father said, serenity came to Bray. He still took down engines in the mess of his paved yard, but he was more circumspect with his surveyor neighbor than he had been with Pitton. He still wore his informal uniform of peaked cap and cardigan. He still talked a lot in the car. But his old readiness to snap and cavil and rant was abated, or, rather, it ran into, meshed in with, his religious talk. He was a man at ease with himself, a man with a secret, an inner vision. He was indifferent to the frenzies of Mrs. Bray. But perhaps, as I suspected, that frenzy was for outsiders, an act, a character that made it easier for her, for so long living hidden away in her house, to go out among people. And because there was no change in this public character of Mrs. Bray's, because I could see always what her talk would lead up to, I dreaded meeting her, once no more than a gentle old voice on the telephone, just as some time before I had dreaded meeting Pitton, whose early gardening rituals it had enchanted me to observe. A big car stopped for me at the bus stop one day. It was a new neighbor. Newer than the surveyor. And this stopping, this offer of a lift to Salisbury, was his way of introducing himself. A big car, a middle-aged man, perhaps in his late 50s, a big house. I had heard it had been put up for sale, but hadn't heard who had bought it, didn't even know until now that it had been sold. The accent of the neighbor was still a country accent. He wanted me to know that he was a local man, that he had known the valley a long time, and that he was already, though new in the house, familiar with the people. He said, "I gave Mrs. Bray a lift last week. She's very fierce these days. Do you know John Bray? Why does he charge so little? He'll have to work till he dies. He provides a good service. He's dependable. He has a lot of regulars, people like him. I've often told him that as a car hire man he should charge as much as the market will bear. But he goes his own way." We passed an old farm, ruined old walls, muddy yard. My new neighbor said, "My mother grew up in that house. Different people now, of course. It was his way, not an unpleasant way, of claiming the valley, claiming kinship with the people of the valley." I thought of Mr. Phillips's father, going watery-eyed at the thought of his early days, the beginning of the century, in the valley, and his first job as a carrier's boy, his boy's adventure of hiding in a bed of withies, when the motor car had knocked down his cousin. There was, in my neighbor's talk, a wish to be linked to that kind of past. The past contained as well in Bray's memories of harvest time and children taking tea to their grandfathers in the fields. But at the same time there was an element in my neighbor, his big quiet car, being driven without hurry beside the river, of the rich man unbending. "How's Mrs. Phillips?" I didn't know there had been anything particularly wrong with her. I was aware only that, like my landlord after his 2 glorious outgoing summers, Mrs. Phillips had retreated, was less in evidence. But I hadn't inquired why. My neighbor said, "I believe her nerves are getting the better of her." Mrs. Bray's rages, Bray's fares, Mrs. Phillips's increased nerves. I was impressed by the minuteness of my new neighbor's knowledge, and I believe he intended me to be impressed. In my mind, with the speeding up of the years consequent on my own aging as well as on my repeating experience of the seasons in the valley, less and less new knowledge added every year, and with the dislocation of memory caused by recent events, like the departure of Pitton, in my mind, he, my neighbor, had only just arrived in the valley. We came to the village with the bridge over the river. My neighbor turned off the main valley road and steered his big car gently over the narrow rail bridge. He said, "I often take this road. There are some pretty little bits." He was at once proprietorial and celebratory, as celebratory of the valley and the river as I had been in my early years. For me, though, the years had begun to stack away, the seasons had begun to repeat. Not so for him. Yet he was an older man and had deep roots here. Perhaps it was that depth of knowledge, added to proprietorship, the ownership of the big house, that had given him his special, almost reverential, view. The bridge was the only one over the river in the valley. The site of both bridge and village would have been old, and though there were no barrows or tumuli here, and the village buildings were mostly of this century, there was a feeling here of the past, not of temples or mysteries, but of human habitation, agriculture, fields or pasture existing over the centuries within the limits of the wet meadows. The feeling was especially strong in the large field beside which we were now driving. I had never seen this field plowed. Its roadside hedge was marked with enormous oaks, thick straight trunks widely and evenly spaced. These oaks, which might have been allowed to grow out of the hedge, suggesting a planting done more than 100 years before, and with what security, what a conviction that this corner of the earth would continue to be as the planter of the hedge and the oaks had known it. In my second or third year in the valley, during a winter of great floods, when the river had overflowed its banks at many places and cut new, fast-moving, noisy channels through the water meadows up and down the valley, all this field with the great boundary oaks had been flooded, creating the effect sometimes, according to the light, of a great white lake, and the swans and the moorhens and coots and the smaller wild ducks and other river birds, leaving the familiar river course, had paddled about this field as long as the lake lasted, as if in addition to the joy of finding a big new feeding ground, there was also the excitement of being on water in a place where normally there was only land. The flood, receding after a few days, had left the field sodden, with little drifts of black mud caught in the grass, and ruffled looking, as though the movement of the water had pushed the grass about in the wrong way. Every winter since then, whenever the black and yellow council notice board, floods, was placed beside the road, I had waited for this drama to repeat. The road ran along a ledge in the down, following the curve of the down. The river was on the right, now closer, now farther away, now almost level with the road, now some way below it. A narrow river, winding in a wide valley, it offered many different views. This drive was quite different from the drive on the other bank. It might have been another river. The road twisted up sharply, the river fell away, fields separated it from the road. Then there was a bushy, overgrown lane that ran diagonally between the fields down to the lushness of the river. My neighbor said, "I used to cycle around here when I was a boy. I loved coming to the top of this hill in order to go coasting down that lane. It ends in a footbridge over the river." When he was a boy 45 years before, perhaps, in the 1930s, with the war coming. Quiet roads, almost empty skies, no constant military roar, as now, no sight, miles away to the west and miles up, of the vapor trails one after the other of commercial airliners, vapor trails usually like disappearing chalk marks, but in exceptional atmospheric conditions coming together to make a thick white arc of cloud from end to end of the horizon, clearly showing the curvature of the earth. My neighbor nodded towards the pair of run-down red brick cottages in the lane. They were the only buildings in the lane. He said, "I often think it would be nice to live there. Shepherds used to live there in the old days, when there were more sheep about." This was my first glimpse of the cottages I was to move to when I left my cottage in the manor grounds. But I didn't remember when I was negotiating for the cottages that I had seen them in the company of my new neighbor, that he had pointed them out to me. At the time I paid little attention to the cottages. I was more interested in my neighbor, seeing in his wish to live in a pair of agricultural cottages another sign of his unbending, another sign of the softness that hinted at other strengths held in reserve. I remembered the drive and the cottages much later, after I had moved and was living in the lane. A car came down the lane one Saturday afternoon. It overshot the cottages and then with difficulty. The lane beyond the cottages was very narrow, barely the width of a car. It reversed into my entrance and parked there. The car was driven by a young man. His passenger was a very old woman. The old woman got out and walked down the lane, past the cottages, then back up the lane. She peeped through the hedge. The young man explained. His grandmother was visiting old places in her life, and she had come to look for the cottage where as a child she used to come to stay with her shepherd grandfather. She remembered a lane narrowing down to a footpath, and then a footbridge over the river. That was the way she used to go in the mornings to get milk from the farm on the other side of the river. The lane she had come to seemed right, the young man said, but his grandmother didn't recognize her grandfather's cottage. And I was horribly embarrassed. Embarrassed to have done what I had done with the cottages, all the things that had disorientated the old lady and made her question where she was, the new entrance and drive, the remodeling of what the old lady would have remembered as the back of the cottages into the front of the renovated house, the extension to the house that had done away with the half of the building her grandfather had lived in, the landscaped garden that had replaced the fruit and vegetable cottage garden the old lady probably remembered. But there would also have been years of unburnable household refuse, some of which had been passed down to me, banking up the hedge mounds, and the garden, choked with bush when I took over, would have gone through many changes, many cycles, before that. Embarrassed, in the presence of the old lady, by what I had done, I was also embarrassed to be what I was, an intruder, not from another village or county, but from another hemisphere, embarrassed to have destroyed or spoilt the past for the old lady, as the past had been destroyed for me in other places, in my old island, and even here, in the valley of my second life, in my cottage in the manor grounds, where bit by bit the place that had thrilled and welcomed and reawakened me had changed. And changed until the time had come for me to leave. And it wasn't until the old lady, with her memories of 70 years before, had come to my new house that I remembered the drive and the detour with my new neighbor, his talk of the people and the beauty of various bits, and his pointing out to me the cottages in the lane which at that time were still more or less like the cottages the old lady had known as a child, but which, when she came to visit them, she found she had lost for good. It wasn't for Mrs. Phillips that the ambulance came. It wasn't for my landlord. It was for Mr. Phillips. He collapsed in the manor one day and was dead before the ambulance came. And all at once it was understood, even by me, in my cottage, how much the manor relied upon him, his energy, his strength, his protectiveness. He was a protector, by instinct and training. He called up the weakness, the need to be protected, in the people he attracted. He was not capable of, would not have understood, a relationship between equals. For people who did not need him, he showed only his grumpy, irritable side, which was his way of dismissing such people. When I had first come to my cottage and, in my stranger's accepting mood, had added Mr. Phillips to my mental catalogue of English types, and seen him as exemplifying his role as country house servant, he had in fact barely arrived, was almost as much a newcomer as I, was still testing out the job and his response to the semi-solitude of the manor, and still hardly knew my landlord. He had grown into the job and made it his own, and over the years he had developed a regard for my landlord, for the softness, the vulnerability, the pride, the obstinacy, all the things that made my landlord a man apart, and which might have been expected to make a man like Mr. Phillips impatient. He had developed especially a regard for the artistic side of my landlord. Though as politically irascible as Bray and as ready to adopt the punchy simplicities of the popular newspapers, Mr. Phillips didn't scoff at my landlord's artistic side, any more than Bray scoffed at it, Bray who one day, as though offering me the key to my landlord's character, had with the clumsy gesture of a man not used to handling books handed me the illustrated verse tale my landlord had published in the 1920s. It was extraordinary, in both these tough, practical men, who almost certainly hated modern art, this idea of the artist or the man of artistic temperament as a man apart. Perhaps, like other ideas, the mad scientist, for instance, derived from the old figure of the obsessed and sinful alchemist, this idea of the artist, the man seeking to recreate the world, went right back to the time when all art or learning was religious, an expression of the divine, serving the divine. I benefited from this regard of Mr. Phillips for the artistic side of my landlord. The regard was extended to me. It was part of the security of my second life in the valley, one of the accidents that made it possible. And now all at once that security was gone. It was decided by Mrs. Phillips that just as Alan's death had been kept by Mr. Phillips from my landlord, so now Mr. Phillips's death was to be kept from him. She didn't think he would take the news quietly, and she feared that she would not be able to manage my landlord if his behavior became in any way extreme. And so, though withdrawn for some time with her nerves, Mrs. Phillips stepped forward once again now and sought to take charge of things. Mrs. Phillips, with the thin blue veins in the dark, finely gathered skin below her eyes, and the more prominent veins at her temples and below her thin hair that spoke of stress and pain. She took to telephoning me. On the telephone now she became long-winded and repetitive. She told me again and again that Mr. Phillips was her second husband, and though she meant no disrespect to his memory and didn't want anyone to think that her love was less, the grief for Mr. Phillips had been like a continuation of the grief for her first husband, that the grief she had felt for him, Mr. Phillips, had been further absorbed by all the things she had had to do after he had collapsed, and all the trouble at keeping the news from my landlord. She was repetitive, but she was reporting on a continuing discovery about herself and the development of her grief. The grief was like something with a life of its own. She was also perhaps saying, perhaps only to herself, that she intended to stay on at the manor, to try to do the job she and Mr. Phillips had done together. And it was only several stages on in my response to the event and to Mrs. Phillips's telephone conversations that I saw that a new uncertainty had suddenly come to Mrs. Phillips's life. I had been shocked when I had first learned that the Phillipses had made no plans for their future, had not laid anything by. Then I had admired them for their adventurousness, their readiness to move on, to make their home in another place. Of course, they could be adventurous in this way because they never doubted that there would always be some new position for them, and it could be said that that kind of expectation was in itself a kind of security. I don't think they had even contemplated retiring. They knew very well that they had taken up an old-fashioned job, but they saw it as a kind of withdrawal, and they had probably seen themselves going on in this way until they were old. Now the active partner had been taken away, and Mrs. Phillips's prospects, if she left the manor, seemed to me fearful. No doubt I exaggerated. I didn't know the Phillipses' friends, didn't know how they lived or joked together. Especially I didn't know about their work, their world of work, and what adjustments they made as workers to preserve their pride. I remembered only how, out of her own security at the manor, Mrs. Phillips had been ready to see Pitton cast out, how much at a loss Pitton had been when he had to leave, how passive he had become, refusing to look for work, out of his unspoken dread of the figure of the employer. But what was true about Mrs. Phillips's grief was not true about old Mr. Phillips's grief. He had coped with the deaths of his father, mother, sister, wife. The death of his cousin in 1911, as he had told me more than once, had prepared him for all their deaths. Now, to his great surprise, in his mid-70s and near the end of his life, he had found in the unexpected death of his son a grief that had surpassed that earlier grief. He was broken, Mrs. Phillips told me. The grounds of the manor that had given him such pleasure after Pitton had gone, he could no longer bear to be there. And he no longer came to work in the vegetable garden, or, formally dressed in a suit or jacket and trousers in the very pale colors he liked, to walk with his pronged staff. It was as though he too had died. As though it was of this death, his son's, that he had spoken when we had seen the first rooks squawking and flapping about the manor beeches. Ivy was beautiful. It was to be allowed to grow up trees. The trees eventually died and collapsed, but they had provided their pleasure for many years, and there were other trees to look at, other trees to see out my landlord's time. So too it had been with people. They had been around, when the time came they had gone away, and then there had been other people. But it wasn't like that with Mr. Phillips. He had been too important to my landlord. My landlord had awakened from his long aesthesia to the tenderness and regard of Mr. Phillips, and the death of this strong, protective man couldn't be hidden beyond a fortnight. My landlord was enraged when he found out, enraged that he had been encouraged to think and talk of a man as living when the man had died. He quarreled and made scenes. He knocked down glasses, overturned full ashtrays, pushed meal trays off his bed, generally tried to make a mess. Grief was beyond him, was too frightening for him. He could express only resentment, and his resentment focused on Mrs. Phillips. She thought it was unfair. What she had done, as she told me on the telephone, had been done for his sake. She thought it was selfish. In his rages there was no consideration for her own feelings about her husband's death. And she thought it was childish. She said, "Nothing he can do is going to bring Stan back." In the early days she had been full of regard for the manor and its master. For the artistic side of my landlord, which was like another emanation of his privilege, she had had a corresponding reverence. She had had something like awe for the little gifts she had brought to me from my landlord, a poem in verse or prose, a drawing, a dainty little basket, a sandalwood fan, some sticks of Indian incense. Sometimes in those early days she had even typed out, perhaps without being asked, the prose poems or prose writings, the act of typing making her job more than that of a housekeeper. What she typed mightn't have been always comprehensible, but that added to the mystery and the beauty for her. She had passed on to Mr. Phillips her reverence for the artistic side of my landlord. But while Mr. Phillips had allowed this reverence to grow, Mrs. Phillips's own reverence had lessened. She had become more matter-of-fact about everything. Gaining security in the manner, she had lost her original feeling of awe. Gaining security, she had looked inwards, concentrated on her nerves, surrendered, like her employer, more and more to the protection of her husband. Now that her husband had gone, she had lost her security. The manor job, which had been so easy for so long, became suddenly hard. The manor became full of tension. And in her dealings with my landlord she went right back to her nurse's attitude. But she was without the strength now to back up that attitude. The man was childish, she said. He wanted attention for the sake of attention. She would have known how to deal with that once, now she didn't. The job began to wear her out. The vegetable allotment within the walled garden was abandoned. But there still came to the grounds some of the strange men whom Mr. Phillips had called in to do occasional pieces of work. While Mr. Phillips lived, these men had walked and moved quickly, like people not anxious to draw attention to themselves, done their jobs and gone away. But now there was no authority, and there was a change in the attitude of these men. They walked more slowly, they walked past the windows of my cottage, they raised their voices. On my way back one afternoon from the river walk I saw two men in the overgrown garden. They had billhooks. They were near the old pile of sawn aspen logs. One man was small, much smaller than Alan, who had worried so much about his size. This man had a sly, dangerous face. In his eyes there was a look that made me feel he had been caught out and resented it. The other man was taller, though not much taller, dark-haired, with dark skin around his dark eyes. The taller man said, without being asked anything, "We are taking away the rotten logs. Margaret knows." She gave permission. Margaret was Mrs. Phillips. It was my policy not to interfere with people I saw in the grounds, not to act as a watchman. But the billhooks, and the dancing blue eyes of the small man, worried me. I said to the man who had spoken, "What is your name?" He straightened up. He almost held his hands at his sides. He said, "Mr. Tom." With two M's. "German." "German? I'm a German." Mr. Tom. Was this how he always introduced himself? Was being a German, he had an English Midlands accent, the most important thing to him, and something he felt he ought to get out of the way as soon as possible? Or was he joking? He said, "My father was a prisoner of war. He worked on a farm near Oxford. He stayed on and married the old carter's daughter. My father died 5 years ago. My mother died last Christmas in Birmingham. I used to live up there. But I lost my job and my wife left me. That's why I'm here." He made a scything, grass-cutting gesture with the billhook. "I love gardening. It's all I want to do. I get it from my mother." I looked at the small man, to see what he was making of the story. He, the small man, was considering me intently. His little cheeks were working. He wasn't going to talk to me. On his small, delicate forearms I saw tattoos done in green and red and blue-black. These colored tattoos, done with modern tools, were a new craze in the locality, spreading without publicity or overt promotion. Bray had told me about them. In tattoos at least the small man was keeping up with his bigger fellows. The talker said, "I'm going through a bad patch." I left them. Just outside the box-bordered enclosure, quite wild now, there was a small pickup van reversed against the entrance, not far from my cottage. For rotten logs alone? I felt that other things, garden statues, urns, stone pots, even greenhouse doors, were at risk, that those two men were scavengers rather than serious thieves. Mrs. Phillips seemed bemused when I telephoned. But she knew the name of the German. "He used to work for Stan. He's a German, you know." Not many days after, the pickup van came again. The German got out, and a bigger, fat, unshaved man with reddish blonde hair reaching down to his shoulders. The fat man wore bell-bottom jeans, and in his hand he held an empty rolled-up nylon sack that was almost the color of his hair. He didn't look at me. The fat man was quite indifferent to me. His eyes were small and preoccupied. His lower lip was thick and red and wet. The German said, "He's my brother. He has nowhere to stay. Last week he got a job with accommodation in an old lady's house. The solicitor arranged it. But they wanted him to be a servant. The old lady used to start ringing for tea at 5 in the morning. He's going through a bad patch." In the days of Pitton, the known and half-tolerated intruders in the gardens and water meadows had been local gentlemen looking for a little Saturday afternoon shooting. Now there was no Pitton. His day and his order seemed as far away and as unreachable as the original grandeur of the garden had seemed to me when I had just arrived, and, among the relics of that grandeur, found only Pitton. There was no Mr. Phillips now, either old nor young. And the people who came to work in what remained of the garden had become marauders, vandals. The very kind of people who, in the great days of the manor, would have given of their best as carpenters, masons, bricklayers, might have had ideas of beauty and workmanship and looked for acknowledgment of their skill and craft and pains. People of this very sort now, sensing an absence of authority, an organization in decay, seemed to be animated by an opposite instinct: to hasten decay, to loot, to reduce to junk. And it was possible to understand how an ancient Roman factory villa in this province of Britain could suddenly, after 2 or 3 centuries, simply with a letting go by authority, and not with the disappearance of a working population, crumble into ruin, the secrets of the building and its modest technologies, for so long so ordinary, lost. And Mrs. Phillips didn't really know what was happening in the grounds around her. She had no means of judging men, judging faces. Depending on herself now, she was continually surprised by people. That stored subjective knowledge of character and physiognomy which most people have, which begins simply enough, with the association of a particular kind of character with a particular kind of face, an association of greed, for instance, with a fat face, to put it at its simplest. That stored knowledge was denied her. It was part of her incompetence, her new unhappiness. And it came out again when she tried to get help, when she advertised for women to help in the manor and was surprised again and again to get people like herself, women adrift, incompetent, themselves without the ability to judge people, looking as much for emotional refuge as for a position, solitary women with their precious things, full of associations for them alone, but without men or families. Women who for various reasons had been squeezed out of a communal or shared life. The first of these ladies came upon me like a vision one lunchtime when I was going out to the bus stop. She was below the yews and she was in brilliant green, and the face she turned to me was touched with green and blue and red, green on her eyelids. The colors of the paint on the old lady's face were like the colors of a Toulouse-Lautrec drawing, made her appear to belong to another age. Green was the absinthe color. It brought to mind pictures by other artists of forlorn absinthe drinkers. It made me think of bars. And probably a bar or hotel somewhere on the south coast was the lady's background, her last refuge, her previous life. How long she must have spent arranging that violently colored face, dusted with glitter even for lunchtime on this summer's day. Where, and to whom, was she going now on her day off? So dreadfully coquettish, so anxious to please, so instinctively obsequious in the presence of a man, everything about her caricatured by age, and the caricature further set off by the rural setting, the yews, the beeches, the country road. What had Mrs. Phillips seen in this woman? How had she thought that this woman, rather than the other applicants she must have had, would have helped with looking after the house and my landlord? Soon enough there were the complaints. Soon enough, complaining of the staff. Mrs. Phillips put herself once more on the side of my landlord, made common cause with him, almost in the way that Mr. Phillips had done, against the crude, uncomprehending world. He rang and asked for a glass of sherry. She went to his room with a bottle in one hand and a glass in the other, and looking as though she herself had had a drop too much. A bottle in one hand and a glass in the other, I ask you. He didn't like it. A little formality, Margaret, he said to me. A little formality. It's all I ask. A drink isn't just a drink. It's an occasion. And I think he's entitled to a little formality. I told her, you know. Taken nothing without a tray. I told her. Poor lady in green! She did something else wrong very soon afterwards. I believe Mrs. Phillips said she again took up a bottle and glass without a tray. She was too old to learn. And she didn't last out her period of probation. I didn't see her go. That glimpse of her, green, the brilliant green of her dress, in the dark green shade of yews and beeches, on the black asphalt lane to the public road and the bus stop, that glimpse of her in her brief rural exile, as she made it appear, was all that I saw. One or two of her successors I saw. Many I didn't. I just heard about them, heard the more sensational stories, from Mrs. Phillips. The arrival of one created consternation. A large removal van drove up to the manor courtyard with her things. None lasted. One wished to do nothing. One wished to take over and give instructions. One rearranged furniture in a number of rooms. Perhaps among them there was one who might have done very well, but had to go for that reason, Mrs. Phillips not wishing to train or nurture a rival and possible successor. The whole situation with the help, or staff, became too much. The sharing of the kitchen and quarters became too much. It was decided that there were to be separate quarters for people from outside. One or two of the closed rooms of the manor were opened up. A decorator appeared. And I felt that my time in my cottage, with the preparation of quarters for new staff, who might not always be single women, who might have families or friends with the privilege of roaming the grounds, I felt that my time in my cottage was coming to an end. Accidents, a whole series of accidents, had kept me protected in what was an exposed situation. Now that protection was coming to an end. The rooks building and cawing above in the beeches, perhaps this was what they had also portended. The decorator, he seemed like an agent or instrument of change, but he wasn't, any more than old Mr. Phillips had been when he had started working and walking in the manor grounds after Pitton's departure. The decorator was a short, plump man, pink-complexioned, or seeming very pink in his white overall. I grew to recognize the rhythm of his day, how he paced himself through his solitary physical labor. From time to time, for fixed periods, 15 minutes in the morning and afternoon, an hour in the middle of the day, he withdrew from his scrapers and rollers and brushes and paint tins and sat in his car, holding the racing page of his paper over the steering wheel, drinking milky tea from his flask in the morning and afternoon breaks, eating sandwiches in the midday break, not being in a hurry then to open his sandwich tin. First giving himself another 15 minutes, or so with the racing page of his paper, and then, having unfolded the greaseproof wrapping of his neat parcel, eating slowly, steadily, without haste, but also without relish. His car at first he parked on the lane just outside my cottage back door. When, using more gestures than words, I showed him what he had done, he without speaking moved nearer the manor courtyard to a spot where he was hidden from the manor and from me. His car was like his castle. Out of it, he was at work, in somebody else's place. In it, he was at home. He looked serene, self-sufficient. In the top pocket of his overall, over a very thick, hand-knitted blue pullover, he had an empty, open, flip-top cigarette packet. This was his ashtray. The gesture with which he flicked ash into this packet was practiced. It was clearly an old habit or procedure, part of his tidiness as a decorator. The tidiness, the concentration required for painting, the way sometimes his face went close to his painting hand, the silence in which he worked for 90 minutes or so at a time, his solitude, this gave him a disturbing presence, made him seem more than his job and his appearance, the pinkness of his skin and the whiteness of his overall. And I found, when I began to talk to him, that he had a curious voice. It was soft, evenly pitched, childlike, passive. He took his cigarette packet ashtray seriously. I said I liked the idea. He didn't dismiss it or make a joke about it. He spoke very seriously about it. He told me when the idea had come to him, and how it had come. People always remarked on it, he said. And as we talked at various times over the days, he was ready to talk. His solitude was like something imposed on him, something he didn't mind setting aside. I found that he took everything about himself seriously, that he regarded himself with a kind of awe. There was something else. He seemed to be looking at himself from a distance, all his habits, his rituals. He was awed by what he saw. He didn't understand what he saw. Even this sitting at intervals in his car, that was puzzling to him, because that was when he also took his pills. He took his pills and studied the racing page, because his dream was to be a full-time gambler, a serious gambler. Not betting like a pensioner on outsiders, but betting on favorites all the time. It was the only way to make a living out of gambling. He needed his pills. He took 2 sorts 4 times a day. He could do nothing without his pills. He went nowhere without his pills. The pills kept him going. And it was through Mr. Phillips, long ago, that he had discovered the pills. That was the connection with Mrs. Phillips, though, as he said, he didn't know Margaret so well. Before the pills he used to burst out crying in public, for no reason. He used to just begin to cry. He didn't know why. He was well off, better off than many people he knew. He had a house, a wife, a car. At first people at work didn't know he was crying. They thought he was just allergic to gloss paint or the new synthetic varnishes. But one day the tears got the better of him, and he had to go to the hospital. He found himself in a ward where the beds had no sheets, only mattresses and blankets. There was very little space between the beds. The nurse was a man. Even through his tears he recognized the oddity of that. The man who was the nurse, Stan, Mr. Phillips, gave him some pills, and he fell asleep. He had never slept so soundly. He woke up feeling so well he was grateful to Stan ever after. That was how he had got hooked on the pills. And Stan helped him more. He was so good to me. He said to me one day, "Look, if you don't pull yourself together, I'm going to have you registered as disabled. You might think there's going to be more benefit for you from the Social Security because of that, but I'm telling you, there's nothing in it for you. There's no extra benefit." Asked the almoner. And he was right. There was nothing in it for me. So I pulled myself together. So sad about Stan. I used to think that if I really had a big win on the horses I would go to Stan and give it all to him. All. Just like that. He made a lifting gesture, as though, as in a cartoon, money came in coin and sacks. I thought I would go and say, "Stan, this is the biggest thing I've done. I want you to take it, because you've been so good to me." His eyes began to water. But they remained expressionless, steady. His face didn't change color. His voice never lost its childlike quality. "I've lost everything now. House, furniture, wife. But that was when the crying left me. When I left my wife. When I left her, I left all my troubles behind. I found her with a man on the Wednesday. I hid her. By Friday they had me out of the house." This was the story he told over many days, saving up this detail for last. And even in this detail much had been left out. Much, for instance, would have gone on before that Wednesday discovery. But that was the way he saw the event, that was what had worked on him. Sitting in his car, flicking ash into the cigarette packet in the top pocket of his overall, he gave a dry sob, like a little convulsion. He said, "It's not for her. It's for Stan." The weather was cool, end of summer, early autumn. Good weather for external painting, the decorator said. The paint had a better consistency. The charged brush moved more easily. It was one of the few bright pieces of knowledge external to himself, that he possessed. But the air that was good for the decorator's brush was also full of end-of-summer dust and exhalations of various kinds. On my walk one afternoon, just beyond what had been Jack's garden, between the old metal and timber and barbed wire farmyard debris below the beeches on one side of the way, and the deep, rubbish-burning chalk pit on the other side, the branches of the now tall silver birches singed a month or so before by a fire that had been fed too richly, I began to choke. I walked round the old farmyard, continuing in the drow way, breathing through my mouth as deeply as I could, to clear the constriction. To the right was the wide low slope, where in the old days the black and white cattle, especially when seen against the sky, brought to mind the condensed milk labels we had known as children in Trinidad, and brought to mind especially a coloring competition for schoolchildren that the distributors of the condensed milk had organized one year. The drawing or outline to be colored was an enlarged version of the label itself. What pleasure, to get as many sheets with the outline as one wanted! What landscapes came to the mind of a child to whom cattle like those in the picture and smooth grassy hillsides like those in the picture, clearly without snakes, were not known. Always on a sunny day on this walk, and especially if at the top of the slope some of the cattle stood against the sky, there was a corner of my fantasy in which I felt that some minute, remote yearning, as remote as a flitting, all but forgotten cinema memory from early childhood, had been satisfied, and I was in the original of that condensed milk label drawing. To the left, across the wide, long grass droveway, was a stretch of pasture now behind barbed wire. All down the pasture on the other side was a plantation of pines, now tall. Dark and thick that pine wood had seemed until one day the stubbled field behind had been set ablaze, and the thin screen of the dark pine trunks had been seen against the fire, roaring like a jungle waterfall I had once heard, giving me the idea that all matter was one, and that all disturbances, whether of fire or water or air, were the same. Just as the firing ranges beyond Stonehenge suggested by their boom that air could be punctured, and just as the military aircraft, more destructive of sky and air each year, had grown to sound like giant railway trains circling about in the sky on resonant iron rails, a magnification of the railway sound which, when I heard it coming from behind the high brick wall at the end of the Earl's Court garden in 1950, heard it very early in the morning and late at night, had seemed to me to hold the drama and the promise of the bigger metropolitan life I had traveled to find. Between the cattle slope and the pine screen the constriction in my chest vanished, as suddenly as it had come. I walked on to where the fenced pasture and the pine screen ended, to where, in a dip between slopes, the great rolls of hay had been stacked years before and never used and never taken away. Too black those rolls now, too mossy green in places, too close to pure rot, for them to be thought of as giant Swiss roll cakes, too black for them to be thought of as larger newsprint rolls for the newspaper presses. Litter, debris, that black grass now, but part of the view, like the long shallow valley behind, open, never tilled, strewn with chalk and flint and looking like a valley in a higher, wilder place, strewn with dirty lumps of old snow. Beyond that, on the droveway, the land sloped up to the Lark Hills, the barrows and tumuli with their tufts of coarse grass and their stunted, wind-swept trees. I knew the walk by heart, like a piece of music. I didn't go all the way to the top of the down. It wasn't necessary. I knew what I would see from there, in that light. I turned back. All the views of the walk unrolled again. Later that evening, in my cottage, the choking fit returned. I felt my bronchial tubes contract and tighten. I waited for the fit to pass. But it didn't. Everything tightened, seized up. Within a few hours I was seriously ill, but oddly light-headed. And it was in this light-headed mood, but seeing everything with great clarity, noticing with surprise and pleasure the unusualness of the view of the valley through the dark windows of the ambulance, that I was taken to the infirmary in the town. I had seen the building for years and had known it was the infirmary, the hospital, but had never thought about it, in spite of the comings and goings on the asphalt forecourt. I had seen it only as a building. I had seen remnants of the 18th century brick, having learned to see age in red or reddish brick, which in 1950 I had found very ordinary, the material of little houses. I had seen the elegant Georgian letters of the legend, stating the voluntary nature of the infirmary and giving the date, 1767, carved right along a band of stone near the top of the flat façade. The infirmary was on the road to the railway station. It was past the bridge. Here the rivers of the chalk valleys all around met and ran together, the water always clear, giving an extraordinary brilliance to scattered pieces of litter, the water seeming, like glass paperweights or like photographs, to have the power to isolate ordinary or well-known objects and force their details on the eye. 10 years before, illness had heightened, had given a special quality to my discovery of spring in the manor garden. The illness of that time, brought on by mental fatigue and travel, had been, to me, though it had lasted for many weeks, like the passing tropical fevers of my childhood, fevers associated with the rainy season, fevers which I thought ran their course too soon and which I longed for again. These fevers of childhood had been welcome because, with their great relaxing internal warmth, they pleasingly distorted the sense of touch and the sense of hearing, made the world remote, then very close, played tricks with time, seeming to awaken me at many different times to the same event, and with this drama and novelty, and the special foods and broths, fevers always gave a feeling of home and protection. With something like that kind of fever, and all that it implied, for the first time in England, of protection and ease, I had seen the peony below my window. In my half-waking delirium the tight red bud had grown tall on its stalk and tapped on my window in the wind, and the single blue iris among the nettles, and the thorny, scented moss roses, and the rotting bridges over the black creeks to the glory of the river. Freshing out. It was with real illness now, a more than passing incapacity, a fatigue that seemed to have gone beyond the body to the core and motor of my being, a fatigue that made it necessary for me to judge very carefully first how many minutes I could be up and about for, and then how many 100 yards I could walk without burning up my strength and falling ill again. It was with true illness that when I came back from the infirmary I began, after some time, to take short turns in the sodden, ruined manor garden. Indifferent to winter for many years after I had come to England, never feeling the need for an overcoat, or gloves, or even a pullover, I now had a sensation of internal coldness such as I had never had before. I felt chilled in my lungs. Grass and weeds were tall and wet, black at the roots with different kinds of vegetable rot. Autumn had once had an enchantment of its own, with the trees and bushes, burning down, in their different ways, with different tints, with the wild mushrooms imitating the color and the shape of the dead leaves they grew among, with last year's dead aspen leaves like lace or tropical fan coral, the soft matter rotted away between the ribs or veins or supporting structure of each leaf, which yet preserved its curl and resilience. I had slowly learned the names of shrubs and trees. That knowledge, helping me visually to disentangle one plant from another in a mass of vegetation, quickly becoming more than a knowledge of names, had added to my appreciation. It was like learning a language, after living among its sounds. Now, with the growth of weeds and the advance of marsh plants, and the disappearance of the rose bed, to be in the garden was like being in the midst of undifferentiated bush. The sections of the fallen aspen trunks that had been too big to saw up or remove had disappeared below bush. The colors of the autumn in the garden were now brown and black. I had learned to see the brown of dead leaves and stalks as a color in its own right. I had collected grasses and reeds and taken pleasure in the slow change of their color from green to biscuit brown. I had even taken pleasure in the brown tints of flowers that had dried in vases without losing their petals. I had been unwilling to throw away such flowers. On autumn or winter mornings I had gone out to see brown leaves and stalks outlined with white frost. Now the hand of man had been withdrawn from the garden. Everything had grown unchecked during the summer, and I felt only the cold and saw the tall grass and the wet and saw black and brown. On these short walks in the ruined manor garden, going a little farther each time, past the aspens, then past the great evergreen tree, then approaching the big white-framed greenhouse, after all this time as solid and whole-looking as it had ever been, on these walks brown became again for me what it had been in Trinidad, not a true color, the color of dead vegetation, not a thing one found beauty in, trash. And it was against this brown that one day, going past the greenhouse to where on my earliest walks towards the river I had found a gate, which still worked when I first came upon it, and bridges over the black, leaf-filled creeks, it was against this black and brown that I saw a new post and rail timber fence, the new wood blonde and red, like the color of the hair of the unshaved fat man the German had said was his brother, like the color of the nylon sack the unshaved fat man was carrying, to take away the rotten logs or whatever it was he had intended to pillage. I hadn't heard about this fence, or the sale of land it implied. The ground all about was wild. Even if I had the energy it would have been hard to go beyond the first creek. But I could see that the line of the new fence ran diagonally across the line of the old path and bridges that led from the garden to the river. A surveyor's line, drawn on a land map, not a line that made allowances for the way the land had been used. I had trained myself to the idea of change, to avoid grief, not to see decay. It had been necessary. because the setting of this second life had begun to change almost as soon as I had awakened to its benignity. The moss roses had been cut down, the open droveway had been bisected by a barbed wire fence, fields had been enclosed. Jack's garden had been destroyed in stages and finally concreted over. The wide gate at the end of the lawn outside my cottage had been closed after Pitton left, and cut branches had blocked the way there. And then barbed wire, of all chilling things, had been wound around what had been built as a children's playhouse in the orchard. I had lived with the idea of change, had seen it as a constant, had seen a world in flux, had seen human life as a series of cycles that sometimes ran together. But philosophy failed me now. Land is not land alone, something that simply is itself. Land partakes of what we breathe into it, is touched by our moods and memories. And this end of a cycle, in my life, and in the life of the manor, mixed up with the feeling of age which my illness was forcing on me, caused me grief. I liked the neighbor. I had nothing against him. He had unwittingly shown me where I was to move. He was reverential about what he wished to acquire. The valley and the land were his in a special way as well. His mother had lived as a girl in a farmhouse, now partly in ruin, beside the river. No lack of reverence there, and I had always known that there was no means of preserving a landscape which, in its particular purity for me, existed for me after that first spring only in my heart. From that first spring I had known that such a moment was going to come. But now that it had come, it was shocking. And as at a death, everything here that had been a source of pleasure and surprise, everything that had welcomed me and healed me, became a cause for pain. The manor help came, lived for a while in the 2 redecorated rooms, each woman in her own way and with her own hallowed things, and then went away. But someone at last seemed to suit, and Mrs. Phillips felt secure enough to start taking up the threads of her private life again. The private life, the one she had shared with Mr. Phillips, had been full of public pleasures, pubs, clubs, hotel bars, modest country town restaurants with dance floors or cabarets, pleasures which, more than house or the sense of place or job or vocation, had given stability and rhythm to the Phillipses' year. This rhythm, overriding her grief, now claimed her, and in the early spring, at what had been one of her and Mr. Phillips's 2 holiday times, she went off for a fortnight with old friends. In her absence, her assistant came out of the manor shadows, showed herself, and explored the grounds without constraint. A thin woman of about 50, as pleased with the solitude and spaciousness of the manor grounds as that other woman or girl had been all those years before, the one who had tied the tails of her shirt above her bare midriff. A different kind of dress on this older woman. She wore an expensive tweed skirt. She had invested much in the skirt. She was like Pitton, I thought, living up to the place and, though a servant, slightly in competition with it. How she changed the place for me! I felt myself, after all these years, under inspection again. When Mrs. Phillips came back, the strange lady withdrew, became timorous, nervous, as though unwilling for her relationship with Mrs. Phillips to be seen too clearly by me. The holiday had done Mrs. Phillips much good. Her forehead was smoother, the skin below her eyes was less dark, less gathered up, and her voice was lighter. This lightness of voice was especially noticeable on the telephone. She sounded quite mischievous when, 2 weeks after she had come back from her holiday, she telephoned to say she had a gift for me and wanted to bring it over. She was in her sporty quilted anorak. She held a walking stick lightly in both her hands, holding the stick horizontally, and when she held it in one hand it was with the gesture of someone not used to a walking stick, not knowing how to hold it or walk with it. She said, "I went to see Stan's father on Sunday. He wants you to have his stick." It was the pronged stick, the staff in the prong of which he rested his thumb as he walked in the grounds of the manor. He was the first person I had seen using this kind of stick. I was myself a user of sticks on my walks. From my father, who had made them for pleasure in Trinidad, from certain forest trees, I had inherited a feeling for walking sticks, and in my early days as a traveler I had always tried to bring back a stick from the country I was traveling in. His pronged staff was the first thing old Mr. Phillips and I had talked about. He knew that when he walked with it in the manor grounds he had my attention. And now it was his gift. Examining it as a new object, a gift, I found it was shorter than I had remembered. I had remembered it as tall as the old man's shoulder. It was in fact the height of the stick fighter's staff, as high as the lower rib of the user. The bark of the prong and of the wood an inch or so below the prong had been peeled. And just below that piece of stylishness was another, a brass-colored metal band. I hadn't noticed that before, in the staff the old man used, and the staff that Mrs. Phillips had brought was so shiny with new varnish that I thought the old man might have bought a new one for me. But the inch-long black cap at the bottom of the staff, a cap in rubber or some composite material, was worn front and back. It was the old man's staff. He had prettied it up because he intended it to be a gift. I said to Mrs. Phillips, "I will keep it as long as I live." Just a few years before, this would have seemed to me a big thing to say. Now the words, as soon as they were spoken, made me feel that the protection I offered the old man's gift was hardly protection at all, that just as certain memories of down and river, chalk and moss, were to die with the old man, be untransmittable, so, even if I could bequeath the stick to some considerate inheritor, I could not pass on its associations. Without those associations, the stick, like the blonde and dark disc of the ivy-choked cherry tree which I had had smoothed down and varnished, a souvenir and a record of the later life of the manor garden, would become no more than an object. Mrs. Phillips said, "Funny old man." Strange words, strange distance between herself and the old man. The distance showed in her face as well, the smoother skin, the new clarity of the eyes, the lack of fatigue. And there was, in the tone of her speech, a reviving irony and love of life. She said, "I think I should tell you before you hear it from somebody else. You know how gossip flies about the valley. I've given my notice." So the gift of the stick acquired another association. Mrs. Phillips's bringing it over, that almost mischievous voice on the telephone, that distancing of herself from old Mr. Phillips, who had until recently walked with such privilege in the manor grounds, that gift was like the winding down of her manor life. How easily she seemed to do it! As soon as I had got to know the Phillipses, had stopped seeing them as exemplars of their job, I had admired them for their adventurousness, their getting by with so little, their readiness to move on. Yet now Mrs. Phillips's news added a touch of desolation to the beauty of the gift she had brought. She said, "I don't have to tell you. It hasn't been much of a life here since Stan died. Stan could have managed. I can't do it by myself. He's very difficult." This was a reference to my landlord. "And it isn't going to get better. That's what makes it hard. It isn't the kind of thing where you feel that what you do is going to make things better." She began to move towards the door. She paused. She looked through the high glass panes of the kitchen door at the broken aspens, growing vigorously again from their stumps. She said, and her tone was intimate, half questioning, half looking for reassurance, "I might have been a relation. I met someone on holiday. He joined our group for dinner one day. So many matchmakers among one's friends. You wouldn't believe. Anyway, I thought I'd let you know before the gossip reaches you. Stan and I agreed on that. Whoever remained should marry again." It was strange. She had never been so easy with me, so without strain, the strain first of all of her strangeness in the manner, her uncertainty with me, then the strain of her illness, then the strain of her solitude. And perhaps, as I thought now, the strain of her life with Mr. Phillips, the man of great strength. And I, as if in response to her new personality, had never felt so close to her. The news, as Mrs. Phillips said, spread fast about the valley. It got to Bray. His first thoughts were for my landlord, the master of the manor. He said, and it was as though he was speaking of himself as well, "Old age is a brutal thing. I suppose they'll just sell up. In the end there'll be nothing left." I said, "It's lasted all his life. Not many people can say that. That's happiness." He stayed with his own thoughts. "When you are young you can fight back. When you're old they can do anything they want with you." His slit eyes narrowed, a tear ran down his soft, middle-aged cheek. In spite of his talk, the dignity of the house had always mattered to him. He had always taken an interest in its affairs. The dignity of the house had given value to his independence. It was what he measured his own dignity against. The deepest part of him, the part with the hidden memories, the memories that would die with him, was his servant's character. Squinting at the road, the tears running down his cheeks, Bray said, "She's left. She became very ill and had to go back to the home." It was the first time he had mentioned the woman he had seen at Salisbury railway station at midnight, the solitary woman in the big tweed coat in the bright lights of the nearly empty station.